challenges that we had and that I had with my board and explaining the concept here is, you know, LGBT poverty, why LGBT poverty, why not poverty? And it's, I think, a really good question. But because a poor kid is a poor kid, you know, and the fact that one kid is gay and one kid isn't, you know, they're still a poor kid and deserve all of our attention and all of our compassion. But we have at our fingertips, we think, a really powerful tool, and that is the power of the gay community. And the LGBT community has never been as powerful as it was during the height of the AIDS epidemic, when we took care of each other. And we proved that we can do that. And so, you know, the evidence is there that there are poor gay kids. And yeah, they're no different than other gay kids, but we've got the ability to mobilize the community to take care of them. And if we don't do that, I think we have to ask ourselves, why not? So I applaud the work you've done. We're happy to support in a small way to get it going. But Stan, maybe my question is, how could you explain what your thinking is on the local application of the money? If you raise $500,000 with Just Like Me in Chicago, would it be your intention that that money would come back into the community, or would it be going elsewhere?
Yeah, so absolutely. So Kim Hunt is the perfect example, Amigas Latinas, Alma. You know, if you're doing good queer poverty work, you can apply for a grant and it'll be a national RFP the same way as other RFPs. And Estrella, basically they were founded as a lesbian funder and have branched out from there. They're an international funder. But, you know, I said, how are you going to do this? And they said, we've got the capacity, we can do this. So we would channel it back through an RFP and hopefully ease the burden that's on Kim Hunt's shoulders, as well as if Howard Brown has a queer need that is not being met, as well as Center on Halstead. So again, you know, and in Oklahoma City there may not be those groups, and instead it may be a Planned Parenthood who has a specific, you know, is doing a program that's specifically about LGBTQ poverty, and it could go there, you know. So it would be that you're doing the work, not necessarily that you're an LGBTQ organization. The other thing I just want to say is, I think this is obvious, but the reason why, so Jim brought up youth, which is so important, but elders are equally important, and race is equally important, and trans is equally important, and you know, and so the umbrella concept of poverty is why we feel like a national campaign might work. And as Jesus said, you know, the poor are always going to be with you. It won't be an idea that will be going away. If we can kind of rally around this, and create an annual reason to stay together as a community, you know, now that we can assimilate, should we, you know, that would be the thought process behind it.
And so Stan, in terms of what you need for the supporting infrastructure and the startup and the launch versus actual contributions to the fund once it's created, what are you seeing as kind of phase one costs for the container for all of this and the staffing?
So the Raven study should cost us around $75,000, and that's the first step towards the campaign aspect. I'm literally, this is in addition to Chicago House full-time work, so I'm going under and I don't have an assistant, so also my hope would be that I would hire an assistant. So we're looking at a budget line for year one of about $125,000. And that's just our part. Our partners also have, we've got some good leads actually with some other funders.
Which I think is, I was going to say though, Stan is very modest. That is a very modest amount of money for the ambitious nature of this venture. So I think you're going to learn that as Raven does his analysis and comes back with a campaign model and structure, there are going to be more clarity about additional infrastructure costs.
You should listen to the geek. She is.
I'm just,
yeah.
I think
yeah,
you're one of those people.
So this is the first step. Obviously, eventually we're going to need to staff the campaign, and that would be a huge next step. Again, I don't think we will need a huge staff, but we will need to increase It would be its own 501c3 alongside of Chicago House. We currently have 2 other 501c3s under our umbrella, so it would be its own standalone, and yet we would need to increase capacity at that moment. But this first step, I think that's the 125, that's just year one. Eventually, as we got to actually mobilizing a campaign, we would hope that that's covered through foundations and that the campaign itself isn't paying for that infrastructure.
Stan,
Yep.
carry us forward a few years. In 5 years, what are the 3 or 4 goals that you hope to have obtained where you say that we have really come a long way and we're successful? Where do you hope to be?
So relative to the campaign, Jim and I have discussed this constantly is, you know, and I think where we've landed, Jim is always like, let's test market Chicago, and I'm always like, in this day and age with virtual and viral, you can't start just locally. But certainly locally in Chicago, we would be the kind of test market as well as allowing it to go beyond that. So TICO at Center on Halstead, you know, we're all interested in partnering and working on this together. So we've got infrastructure here to build it, to slam it home in its first few years, that by year 4 or 5, we would have that, hopefully that same success in other cities. And again, the real goal is you know, we don't want the Pride Parade to go away, right? It's too much fun. So we need to keep to be rallying around something, because our whole goal with marriage equality has been basically the assimilation of our culture. And this is the moment to stop and say, just because we can assimilate, should we assimilate? Or are we, in fact, better as a community, developing a JUF model where we're actually taking care of people? And if we could succeed at that, then can we help teach other communities how to do something similar outside of LGBTQ?
And then on the knowledge building side of the equation, which is to us integrally connected to all of this, you're going to be building knowledge by doing the research about how to communicate and how to motivate the community to give. But we really have a number of projects that you both have identified that really are needed. Do you want to talk about some of those ideas that the research team's been kicking around?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got we have this list of kind of unmet needs, which is very long. There's not a lot there. So some of it is wanting to be able to identify, having a list of who's actually doing this kind of work in the service community and feeding that into the convening so that this policy agenda is emerging, learning from them, from those organizations about the people that they're serving, what those barriers are for LGBT people in particular, and understanding what those best practices are. So as we start to identify those are tangible outputs that will feed right back in to the agenda building on the policy side and the service provision on the side that Dan's been talking about.
I'll just to add to Lee's comment, and it kind of really brings me to this question of, and we hear this a lot when we talk about kind of subgroups, and well, why do you care about that subgroup? We should just be talking about everybody. But as we know, for any of us who've worked in services, or for those who are funding services, when you talk about how to do something, you have to understand how you got there. And if we're not willing to think more deeply about how sexual orientation and gender identity matter for these differential experiences, then we're actually missing our understanding of the root of the problem. So there might be some shared ways that the problems come about for all groups. But clearly if we're seeing some of these disparities, then there are also some distinctions. And so the research that we've been talking about is about getting the better understanding. The idea would be in 3 to 5 years we'd be able to make statements about to what where does sexual orientation and gender identity matter for how people enter into poverty. Is it there? Is it about discrimination at the larger level, at the level of employment, about experiences in families of origin for foster care children, for example, or homeless youth? But then where also does experiences within non-LGBT social service organizations or other types of federal programs, where do experiences in accessing those services actually predict or account for the higher level of LGBT folks staying in poverty, or the higher level of LGBT youth staying in foster care and not getting out of foster care, right? And so if we don't understand those pathways, how do we design services and programs and policies to address those needs? And while we wouldn't argue that you stop and you don't do anything until you have more empirical research, we're not going to say that. But at the same time, we should be doing this work alongside one another so that, each is informing the other, and, we would have more to say about how these things matter.
Yeah, and if I could add to the 5-year mark, I think there will be really concrete things we can say we've succeeded with this collaborative in things like the federal government adds sexual orientation and gender identity questions to surveys like the current population survey or the survey of income and program participation, which is how we really learn about these things, which is the goal of this research arm, is we will be able to make the case even more strongly that the federal government has a role to play. And I think if in 5 years we've got those data, we will have succeeded. I think if you see LGBT organizations go to bat when SNAP benefits get cut, which is coming up. This year we're going to have a big fight over SNAP benefits. And I think if we've done our job, then the LGBT movement, with its political power, which we have some, we're in a good moment right now, that we actually bring that to bear to help not just poor LGBT people, but poor people generally. So I think there will be a few things that in 5 years are perfectly reasonable, and I think if you start to hear LGBT and anti-poverty organizations talking about LGBT poverty, I think we'll have done our jobs. And I think that includes funding organizations, which is why I'm so glad that you all are here. We work on health, I'll use that as sort of a related example. And we've had a really difficult time getting health funders to see LGBT health as part of the health narrative in this country. And worked very, very hard, and we're very fortunate at getting the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to give its first LGBT health related grant for an enrollment campaign that we did. And so I think it's those types of things that we want to set out as benchmarks for getting this job done, and I really applaud you all for seeing the value in this discussion and thinking about ways that we can all take part.
And if I could tag on to that, just when we held a congressional briefing, there was quite a bit of excitement about the idea that, so if you just took SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Silo in DC, there are very few grants that target our community. There are many grants that target other communities, and yet our substance abuse rates are sky high compared to other communities. So to actually start pushing for those same set-aside fundings, not on the public side as well as the private side, that actually address these needs is really important.
And I think that the other, on the funding side, on the private philanthropy and public foundation side of it, you all know very well that there's still very, very, very little funding available for LGBT policy work and organizing and advocacy work. The movement's advancement in general has been funded by a relatively small group of foundations. And what is it, the Funders for Lesbian and Gay Issues data says 0.24% of all philanthropy goes to LGBT.
It's 0.01.
0.01 for trans. And so we're still, so we're really appreciative of those of you all who are doing LGBT-specific funding. And because one of the things I've learned from working in this movement for 35 years is that it does matter. I mean, there are sexual orientation and gender identity contribute to our life experiences in unique ways and require unique fixes, in addition to the broader changes that we need to make in general systems. So I started out as a prisoner's rights lawyer at the ACLU, and I've come full circle in doing all this criminal justice work. One of the things we're working on in the Criminal Justice Coalition is the whole question of the use of protective custody for vulnerable populations inside prisons and jails. On the one hand, it's necessary because those populations are vulnerable. On the other hand, protective custody is this restrictive, oppressive, punitive status. And so that is the same as solitary confinement. So part of our mission is to change the way they use solitary confinement overall. But a sub-mission is to think about how protective custody is operating to affect LGBTQ people and other vulnerable populations. I'm trying to make an analogy of how you can work on the specific and the broader, and it's constant in LGBT work, constant.
Other questions? Ideas?
How many funders in the room are currently in some way involved in anti-poverty? Do you call it that, or do you call it economic opportunity? How do you call it?
Economic security.
Economic security. Is poverty like a 70s word?
No, just not as flashy and, not as flashy and silly.
Not as positive.
Yeah.
It seems to me with funders, there's always, you look for a point of purchase, right? And this, we've seen a broad array, but there are opportunities here within each of the different pieces of this.
Yeah.
How would those be communicated to this group?
Well, we have a, funny you should ask, we have it feels more coherent to us than it probably does to you, that this all kind of weaves together beautifully out of that meeting that you did, Jim. But we do have a bigger paper, and we've thought carefully about the different projects and what they would cost. And really, all three of the sets of work that we talked about, improving the knowledge base, developing the LGBT economic agenda, and doing this, engaging the community in a campaign. It's about $440,000 a year for 2 years. So I feel like that's, we've been really frugal and trying to count on a lot of subsidizing from different organizations around convenings, for example. And we're really committed to this idea of not just being a bunch of wonks in a room, like making it up, but like getting out there around the country, talking to groups like Chicago House and its counterparts, the community centers, the health centers, poverty-serving agencies that are seeing large numbers of queer people in their service populations, and getting input from them through surveys and conversations and convenings of them, focus groups with them, then also getting out there and spending 2 or 3 days going deep about what are your challenges. Now I think we're just old school feminists in that way. We think we're going to build it from the input up, instead of the top down.
We actually, and we do have copies, just Terry, we do have copies of that, that you all have my email because I sent you all reminders, so just email me and I can send you a copy of the full
The bigger proposal.
Yeah.
It's not really a proposal, but it's a concept proposal. Yeah.
Terry?
In response to your question, as a local funder, I will leave here confused. Because I don't know if you're trying to build a national movement that will be attractive to national funders, but then you use the JUF metaphor, which to me is a local place-based initiative. Because I get the concept of creating a model that Christopher House would lead in building in I think a very innovative, creative approach to developing an annual fund and serving as a point of cohesion for the broader community, and tying it to the Pride Parade and building that, and that's a logical thing for a local funder to get engaged with. But as soon as you then talk about those dollars get jettisoned to national work, I completely lose interest. One, I think the boat is too small, and then it's just not our domain. But I love the idea of creating a local demonstration of a JUF. A gay UF is fabulous and infinitely doable, and that's the sort of structure that could then be replicated across the country. So that's the quandary that I find myself in as a funder.
It's a great question.
Just a quick response to that, I hear what you're saying, but also see that this is a way of positioning Chicago and Chicago House in a lead role in something that will have national impact, but also have its roots here and have beneficial outcomes here. And if some of the dollars raised, I see Estrella from what you describe as simply the mechanics, not the decision-making body, that any dollars that would be raised and intended to return to Chicago, as could be the case with any donation, could be earmarked for Chicago, right?
Absolutely.
So even though the location of that piece of the mechanism is elsewhere, I think as much as Chicago wants to invest in as a group of funders and as a network of agencies, those are investments and choices we can make and lead and ensure happen.
Thank you, Marianne, and I appreciate it also as well, Terry. If you want to use kind of what's happening in the trans community as a metaphor, you know, through the opening of the Trans Life Center, through the Trans 100, which is actually this Sunday, which is, it recognizes national leadership in the trans community, through the fact that we, as far as I know, have the only billionaire trans person in the world, through the fact that Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart is leading the country and being progressive and proactive on trans issues with incarceration. Like Chicago House has become like a spotlight of what's going right in trans. And while it would be a national movement, I do hope and pray that Chicago would be kind of the model of how this actually can work and succeed. So it would be both things. I mean, it would be, you know, I wouldn't want to limit it to Chicago and the days of virtual and viral campaigns, you know, but if you take that to the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, but we can slam it home here, you know, after 15 years at Chicago House, I know all the bar owners, like, you know, to have like tip jars where people are seeing this everywhere they go will be a critical aspect, and obviously that won't happen in Houston because we're not in Houston. So.
And to add to that as well, I mean, we're thinking big, you'll see it in the proposal, but even from the research perspective, I think there's things that could be done to help inform, certainly maybe at an Illinois level, but maybe even a Chicago level as well, that, you know, we're trying to be really creative about the types of data that we can find and use to understand what's going on within different geographic regions. And as many of you I'm sure know, a lot of these programs are administered at a state and local level, and so what we're interested in doing as well is developing sort of local policy agendas that can help you know, advance anti-poverty initiatives within a specific, again, region or locality. There's a lot of interest in place-based work, and I think, you know, using Chicago as a great example, or using Illinois as a great example of understanding how state, local ordinances, state laws, national grant making happens. You know, I think we are in a position to be able to advance local solutions even while approaching this as something that we want to push nationally. So we would be looking to do that, I think, in our research as well.
Somebody back there had a hand up.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry. It's also my hope that as the national research starts to show detail, that it will become clear where funding gaps are bigger and where needs are larger, and that then some of the funding decisions can be made based on that gap information. And I have no doubt that Chicago and our Southside communities would rise near the top of that. I mean, we clearly have need here in our community, and so I hope that this will be one way to help point that out and funnel money in that direction.
So, love the part about raising money. That's awesome, essential, and I think that it makes sense that that's the driving force. The policy piece was also mentioned, but Stan and Urvashi, you know, in the beginning, you acknowledged this racial and economic stratification within our communities. And, you know, maybe Chicago's the right place to demonstrate that too. How do we change attitudes? And is that a part of the mix in all this work?
It has to be, right? So we don't want to create a Band-Aid. We want to create a long-term systemic change. And again, from what research I've done over the last 3 years, like nothing does that as much as, going back to the It Gets Better campaign, than kind of the power of narrative. So it would be in the interplay of stories. And I did mention, I'm not wed to the just like me. You know, that may not be the right phrase. Another phrase that Kevin Jennings raised in DC was, marriage equality is not lived equality. But whatever it is, it's going to need to involve people and their narratives to show that those guys inside tracks and those kids on the street actually have something in common as you play out how they came out to their families, how they came out to their friends, you know, their process to start forming a better understanding of one another.
But, and my answer is going to come at it from the importance of policy and research. And I mean, I feel like, yes, there is stratification in our community. And the groups that are working on poverty and racism and overcriminalization and hunger are actually different than the groups that are working on marriage equality, non-discrimination laws, getting access to the military, and, you know, even some basic, like, trans non-discrimination issues. So, and they're not necessarily hostile to each other, but they're different. The groups that are working on these kinds of issues tend to be more the service provider type groups, service organizations, legal services groups, the Urban Justice Center in New York, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, the Transgender Law Center, those kinds of servicing organizations, the 140 community centers around the country that have different social services within them, the LGBT serving community centers, right? And that is the universe of people that we think has been less represented in the policy agenda of our movement. I mean, they've been represented in the fact that, of course, all of us believe in basic rights. And as Laura's slide pointed out, you need fundamental equal protection under the law in order to have the ground that you stand on. But that's the starting line, not the finish line.